My brother told every contact in the regional catering industry that I had stepped back from Keswick to pursue other opportunities. I had not stepped back. I had been quietly restructured out of the company my grandmother built over 40 years from a rented commercial kitchen in Tacoma, and the distinction mattered enough that I thought about it for most of 2 years before I finally did something about it. 26 months after the Wednesday meeting where my title was dissolved over conference room coffee, my brother called me from the parking lot of our central prep kitchen at 11 in the evening and said he needed my help. He didn't say please, but I could hear it underneath everything else he said, which was almost nothing. My name is Corinne Aldwell, and I grew up at Keswick & Company Catering. Not as a figure of speech, literally. I did homework in the back office while my grandmother prepped for Saturday weddings. I folded napkins into fan shapes at age 7 because my hands were small enough to do it quickly and because she told me small hands made better folds than large ones, and I believed her without question. I learned that a well-run event tells guests they are worth the care before anyone speaks a single word. I learned this from a woman who had borrowed against the equity of our house in 1979 to start a catering operation, who had needed my grandfather to co-sign the business loan, because banks in those years did not extend credit to women in business on their own, and who had turned that loan into one of the most respected event catering companies in the South Puget Sound over the 4 decades that followed. By the time I was working there full-time, first as event coordinator, then as operations manager, then VP of operations, Keswick had 68 employees, 3 anchor corporate accounts that renewed annually without prompting, and a reputation in our market for running events where things did not go wrong. My father had taken over from my grandmother when she retired, and when his cardiologist began talking seriously about stress and workload, the understanding within the family, not formalized, not in writing, but understood the way these things are understood over Sunday dinners, was that I would take on expanded operational responsibility while my brother, who was a decade older than me and had spent most of his career in commercial real estate before returning, when my father's health began declining, would handle the external-facing side of the company. That understanding turned out to be mine alone. The meeting was a Wednesday in March, and my brother had scheduled it on the calendar as a leadership restructuring discussion, which I assumed meant reporting lines or title changes. He had brought in an outside HR consultant I had never met, and the two of them sat across the conference table from me and explained that Keswick's new direction required a leaner executive team with clearer separation between operations and strategy. My VP of operations role was being redesigned. I could remain as an operations coordinator. He described it as a lateral move in a tone that communicated he did not genuinely believe this, or I could transition out with a standard severance package. He said, and I have returned to this sentence many times in the years since, that I was talented at the ground level, but that I lacked the financial acumen required at the leadership table going forward. I was the person who had renegotiated our linen service contract to save $38,000 annually. I was the person who had caught a staffing error 4 hours before a 400-person hospital gala and resolved it without a single guest knowing anything had nearly failed. I was the person who had built the event staffing model our coordinators were still using. But I lacked financial acumen. I took the severance. I packed my office, a photograph of my grandmother at our first downtown Seattle event, the small ceramic bowl she had given me when I received my first promotion, the staffing binders I had built from blank pages, and carried the box to my car and sat in the parking lot for a long time before I drove anywhere. I thought about calling my father. I thought about calling my grandmother, who was still alive then and still sharp, and asking her what to do. I didn't call anyone. I went home. I was 31 years old, and I had just been told I wasn't capable of running the thing I had spent 6 years helping to run. I gave myself 3 days to sit inside that before I decided what came next. What came next was getting very quiet and very methodical in that order. A restaurant group management company in Portland reached out 6 weeks after I left Keswick, and I accepted and relocated. In Portland, I managed multi-unit food service operations across 7 locations, a scale that was larger and less personal than anything I'd known at a family company, and that turned out to be precisely what I needed. I learned vendor contracting in an environment where there was no family history to paper over the gaps and no one with your last name to absorb the consequences of assumptions. I learned to read a profit and loss statement the way my grandmother read event floor plans, scanning for the line that didn't align with the others. The number that was slightly off from what the surrounding numbers suggested it should be. I sat for my certified food service management credential on evenings and weekends. I relocated to Seattle after 14 months and took a position with a hospitality operation consultancy that worked with mid-sized event venues across the Pacific Northwest. I told myself on a regular schedule that I was constructing a life that had nothing to do with Keswick. I don't think I believed it once. The calls from Pauline started around 8 months after I left. Pauline had been with Keswick for 17 years, longer than I had been old enough to vote, and handled payroll and administrative operations with the particular quiet competence of someone who has been doing a job well for so long that it no longer requires her full attention. She called me the way a person calls a friend when they're worried but haven't decided yet whether to say so directly. The calls were warm. She asked about Portland, about my apartment, about whether I'd found good coffee yet, and then, almost as footnotes, she mentioned things. Details she thought I might find interesting. She mentioned that a new supplier, Pacific Ridge Foods, had taken over the majority of the produce, protein, and catering supply contracts that had previously been distributed across 4 vendors the company had worked with for years. She mentioned that the contract with our longtime bakery supplier, a family operation in Puyallup that had supplied our pastry program since before I was born, had been terminated without any explanation she could locate in the documents she had access to. She mentioned that the new director of vendor relations was 27 years old, had a background in hospitality sales, and happened to be her sister-in-law's younger brother. She mentioned in the same careful passing way that 3 of our most experienced event coordinators had left within a 12-month span, 2 of them for direct competitors. I told Pauline, each time, that I appreciated her thinking of me, that I hoped the new direction was working well for everyone, that things had a way of finding their level. I said none of what I was actually thinking, because 2 years of silence had taught me that the first condition for having something meaningful to say is knowing the right moment to say it. I began reviewing the public record. Washington State maintains a searchable business licensing database, available to anyone who wants to use it. Pacific Ridge Foods LLC had been registered 20 months before I started looking, operating out of a Renton address. The filing listed 3 LLC members. One of them shared a last name with my sister-in-law. I want to be precise about what I felt when I found that, because it would be easy to frame it as a moment of vindication. What I actually felt was cold and very still. The way you feel when something you had quietly suspected turns out to be real, and the reality of it is not satisfying in the slightest. I sat with the database record open on my laptop for a while. Then I closed it and went for a walk around the block, and came back and looked at it again, and it said the same thing it had said before. I reached out to Alicia, a CPA I had met at a food service management conference 2 years earlier, who did forensic financial consulting on a project basis. I explained what I had found in the public record, only the public record, I was explicit about that, and asked if she could do a clean, properly sourced review of everything legitimately available. Public contracts, public filings, public pricing data from comparable procurement records. Nothing she wasn't entitled to access. She came back to me 4 months later. Her summary was 12 pages long. Pacific Ridge Foods had been billing Keswick at rates averaging 38% above comparable market pricing for equivalent product categories. Alicia had pulled pricing from catering supply contracts in the public procurement records for King County and Pierce County event services. Documents that are filed and available to anyone who cares to look. Across 26 months of documented contracts, the difference between what Keswick had been paying and what the market rate was for the same goods came to approximately $2.1 million. Alicia was careful about how she framed her conclusions, which I respected. She said she could document what the public record showed. She said what it meant was for others to determine. She also said in the same measured way that in her professional experience, a newly registered LLC with membership connected to a company executive, receiving exclusive supply contracts at rates significantly above market, was a pattern she had encountered before. In her experience, that pattern indicated self-dealing at minimum and a potential breach of fiduciary duty. I filed her report in a folder. I went back to work. I waited. Waiting was the hardest thing I have ever done, and I want to say that plainly. I think people imagine patience as something noble people feel while they wait. a kind of practiced calm. It isn't. Patience, in this circumstance, was making a deliberate choice, over and over again across months, to not do the thing I wanted to do, which was to call my brother and tell him exactly what I had found. I didn't, because I understood that acting too early, or acting from a place that looked like personal anger rather than documented fact, would get the report dismissed. He would call it a grudge. He would use the same words he'd used in that conference room in March, and I had no interest in giving him that opportunity again. I was 33 years old and I had been told I lacked financial acumen. The report I was holding was my answer to that sentence. I needed it to be so sourced, so specific, so airtight that nobody could look at it and reach for the word emotional without embarrassing themselves in the process. Pauline called me in October. This time there was no careful preamble. She was frightened, and she didn't try to soften it. The Cascadia Health System had sent a formal letter of non-renewal for their annual catering contract, one of the 3 anchor corporate accounts that had been with the company for the better part of a decade. A second corporate account, a technology firm in Bellevue we had serviced for 9 consecutive years, was reportedly not renewing either. The company's line of credit with their bank was up for review at the end of the quarter. Without those 2 contracts on the books, the revenue base didn't support the credit line. 68 people. "I don't know what happens to any of us," she said. "I do," I told her. "Let me handle it." I did not go to my brother. I drove to Tacoma on a Saturday morning and sat down across from Jean Talbot, the attorney who had represented my grandmother since the late 1980s and who still served in an informal advisory capacity with the company. He was in his late 70s, still sharp, and had known me since I was a child sitting in his reception area, eating the wrapped candies from the dish on his receptionist's desk. I put Alicia's report on his kitchen table and walked him through what I had found and precisely how I had obtained it. He read every page, then went back and read several of them a second time. He didn't speak while he was reading. When he set the report down, he had the particular stillness of someone who is choosing his next words with care. "Your father hasn't seen this," he said. It wasn't a question. I said no. He picked up his phone. I don't know the specific details of what Jean did over the following week, because I wasn't present for most of it and I didn't ask. I know he made calls to the 2 independent advisory board members who had been added to the governance structure 3 years earlier. I know an emergency advisory session was called and held. I know that both independent members, after reviewing the report, requested an independent financial audit as a condition of proceeding with the bank credit review. My brother was asked to step back from operational decision-making pending the audit's completion. He called me 4 times the day the advisory session ended. I didn't answer. He called twice the following morning. Then he drove to my apartment. I hadn't seen my brother in almost 2 years. He looked smaller than I had remembered, which surprised me. He had always seemed to take up a particular amount of space with certainty. He stood in my doorway with the posture of a man who had arrived, prepared to be angry, and spent that preparation somewhere on the drive over. "You went around me," he said. I went to Jean. "That's the same thing, and you know it." He shifted his weight. "You never wanted this to work. You wanted me to fail so you could be the one who came back and fixed it. That's what this has always been about." I thought about the word acumen. I thought about an HR consultant I'd never met sitting across a conference table, flanked by my brother, delivering a decision that had been made before I walked into the room. "You told me I didn't have the financial acumen to sit at the leadership table," I said. "Tell me, standing here right now, what part of a $2.1 million above-market vendor arrangement, registered to an LLC with your wife's family name in the member filing, suggests to you that I wasn't paying attention to the finances?" He didn't answer that. He tried something softer, which I had anticipated. He reminded me of the summer he'd taught me to close out a point-of-sale system when I was 16. He reminded me that he'd introduced me at industry events as the person who actually kept Keswick running. He said our grandmother would have wanted this handled inside the family. "Our grandmother built this company by refusing the terms other people tried to hand her," I said. "I don't think she would have wanted us to quietly handle the thing that was going to end it." He left without saying goodbye. That was the last real conversation we had for a long time, and I think somewhere in the parking lot he understood that it was. The audit moved with more speed than I had expected. Pacific Ridge Foods' exclusive supply arrangement was terminated within 30 days of the audit opening. The contract terms didn't survive independent review. The director of vendor relations resigned before the preliminary findings were formally released. His attorney had apparently advised him that remaining in place would complicate things considerably. The LLC was dissolved in the months that followed. The lawsuit my brother floated in a voicemail, vague, details-free, more threat than plan, never materialized. According to Gene, the legal advice he received ran strongly against any action that would invite further public scrutiny. The bank renewed the line of credit. The renewal came with conditions: quarterly financial reporting, a formalized audit committee, documented conflict of interest protocols for anyone in a procurement-adjacent role. These were requirements the company should have had in place years earlier. Pauline was promoted to director of operations. She cried when I called to tell her, and then she laughed at herself for crying and said she was too old to get emotional about a job title, and I told her there was no age at which crying about something you'd genuinely earned was inappropriate. 2 of the 3 event coordinators who had left came back within the year. The third had found a position she preferred, and I was genuinely glad for her. My brother kept his equity stake in the company. The above-market billing differential from Pacific Ridge was treated, in the restructured operating agreement, as an unauthorized draw against his equity position, to be offset across several years through reduced distributions. There was no criminal referral. I want to be clear that this was a choice, not an oversight, and it was largely mine to make. What my brother had done was serious. It had endangered 68 people's livelihoods, and the continuity of something my grandmother had spent 4 decades building. But the arrangement had been structured in a way that placed it, under legal review, in civil liability territory rather than criminal exposure, and I had no interest in destroying what remained of my family in order to make a point I had already made in 12 documented pages. I have thought about that decision many times in the years since. I still believe it was right. I am not certain it was the consequence my brother deserved. I am certain it was the decision my grandmother's company deserved. The advisory board offered me the general manager position 3 months after the audit closed. I accepted on 2 conditions. First, that the governance structure be formalized in writing before I signed anything: independent audit committee, documented vendor approval protocols, mandatory conflict of interest disclosures for anyone in a procurement-adjacent role. Second, that the company's founding history be formally written and archived: who started it, what it had cost her, what she'd refused to accept along the way, what it had survived. My grandmother had given 40 years to this company. It deserved a record that would outlast any one person's version of it. Both conditions were met. My brother and I have been in the same room twice since the audit closed. Once at a family occasion neither of us could gracefully avoid. Once when he appeared at the prep kitchen entrance unannounced. I didn't ask why, and he didn't explain. He stood at the threshold and looked at the space the way someone looks at a room they recognize, but can no longer locate themselves inside. We acknowledged each other. He left. It was not forgiveness, and it was not the opposite of forgiveness. It was 2 people who had exhausted the particular version of each other they'd been carrying around. The first major event I ran after returning was a retirement gala for the outgoing president of a regional healthcare nonprofit. 320 guests, 5 courses, a string quartet through cocktail hour, and a 12-piece band for the reception. Florals sourced from a farm in the Snoqualmie Valley. We ran it out of the central prep kitchen. My grandmother had designed herself in 1991, the layout she had sketched on graph paper at our kitchen table after I had gone to bed. The kitchen, she had told me, was built so that everyone who worked in it would understand, from the flow of the space alone, that care was the whole point. I was in that kitchen at 4:30 in the morning when the first prep team arrived. I watched the mise en place come together station by station. I watched the timeline hold through every course. I stood at the edge of the kitchen after the last guest had gone, and the breakdown crew was clearing the final tables. And I thought about every version of this building I had ever stood in. I thought about being 7 years old, learning to make fan folds because my hands were small enough to do it right. I thought about a Wednesday morning, a conference table, an HR consultant I never saw again, and a sentence about what I lacked. I thought about my grandmother in 1979, sitting across a desk from a bank officer who required a man's signature before he would take her seriously, and deciding that this particular obstacle was not the point. What she was going to build was the point. The obstacle was just the starting condition. My brother once said I didn't have the financial acumen to sit at the leadership table. What I brought to that table, when it finally mattered, was 12 sourced pages, $2.1 million in documented above-market vendor billing, and 4 months of a CPA's careful work, obtained through nothing more complicated than patience and a public records database anyone could access. That turned out to be more than enough. More than any informal succession plan sketched out at a Sunday dinner and never written down. More than a title that could be restructured out of a meeting room on a Wednesday in March. The kitchen smelled like clarified butter and fresh thyme and the faint sweetness of stone fruit from the dessert course, the way it has always smelled, the way she designed it to smell. I had not inherited Keswick & Company catering. I want to be exact about that. I earned my place in it the only way still available to me after everything else had been taken off the table. And it turned out that was not just enough. It turned out to be the only credential that couldn't be restructured away and handed to someone else when no one was watching. Some things, once properly built, stay built.